Steve Parrish began serving with the U.S. Forest Service in 1963. He transferred to the BLM in 1985 and served as the BLM Nevada Cadastral Chief from 1989 to 1995. He retired in 1995 to pursue private surveying experience. He is licensed in 10 Western states and a Nevada water rights surveyor, and is the Inyo County and Mono County surveyor in California from 1999 to 2012. Steve has contributed to the Surveying Handbook by Brinker and Minnick and is an active workshop presenter and instructed the BLM Forest Service Advanced Cadastral Survey courses for 12 years. Steve worked for Tri-State Surveying from 1999 to 2012, taught a course on the manual for Great Basin College from 2004 to 2016, acquired his CFED certification in 2007, his bachelor's degree in 2009. He's employed by Loomis and Associates and is the Alpine and Mono County surveyor and is the CFED panel chairperson and training coordinator. He enjoys sharing his 54 plus years of surveying experience, travel with the family, photography, and fishing. He is our Nevada living legend, as we call him. I had finished up the last edition of the Traverse, and it was kind of all dedicated to Steve and his career. So without further ado, Mr. Parrish, we enjoy you jumping on with us tonight and sharing your vast knowledge. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Trent. I appreciate that. I've come full circle to realize it's a lot better to be a living legend than a dead. So
it's right.
It did just put me right on my knees. When Trent tried sneaking that in one Sunday night, I think he thought maybe I'd gone to bed or something, and so he sent me an advanced copy, and my wife stuck her head in the room to see why I wasn't in bed yet, and I was sitting here crying, and she says, "Well, what's wrong?" I says, "Well, there's nothing wrong, but these guys have just humbled me more than I can stand." So I do appreciate it, though.
Of course, thank you.
That's what it's all about. The information.
I tell you that I bet Trent would agree that there was way more written about you than could fit in the Traverse.
Exactly.
Well, we've all made our mistakes at times, but we hope we come out on the good side at the end of it all, right? So most of the workshops that I present are not highly technically oriented. Occasionally they want some things on calculations and things of that nature. And of course, I've been out of the field for so long now, I don't know if I could find the on button on a piece of survey equipment, but at any rate, to me, a day in the field is a day accomplished, and that's always been, I've lived with another motto that the very worst day in the field beats the best day in the office. But at any rate, I've had the opportunity of tracing good old Mr. Benson and a lot of others over my years. And Benson was not that bad a guy when he did the surveys himself in 1874 forward for several years. But then all of a sudden, a special deposit system came along when he and a few others could see a real money-making process where they greatly shortcutted some surveys and not others, and gathered a bunch of money. And a couple $1 million back in the 1870s, 1880s was a lot of money back then. But they did finally get caught up with, but John Benson never really actually got prosecuted for his crimes. But that's another story for another day. This particular township here is just down out of Walker, California. And as you swing out of Walker, heading up the Walker River, as you go on over in towards Bridgeport and so forth, you'll go right up the throat of this particular survey. And it was at the time that I got involved with this particular township, is when I had taken over the project office in Carson City, and actually it was under the direction of the California State Office of the BLM. I had just transferred from the Forest Service out of Albuquerque, New Mexico, up to little old Carson City, Nevada on January 1, 1985. And pretty soon we were into a number of townships, and what the project was all about was doing surveys under the BLM authority for the national forest. We had 9 different counties that I dealt with around Lake Tahoe and all of the national forests that surround it. So this was one of the surveys that the Forest Service wanted done, and all they wanted to do was do a bunch of land acquisition and exchanging and that up that river corridor. Well, that sounded simple enough, and when we got into it, first thing I noticed was we had, of course, a boundaries that was surveyed by Benson and Glover, and then the interior 5 years later by another surveyor. So I decided today to bring along a few of our colleagues out there, just a bunch of typical surveyors laying around in the field, and some looking for corners and some not. And the thing is, we are still burdened, whether we're down in the city or whether we're out in the hills, we're burdened with the challenge of finding some kind of a monument or something that represents a line that relates to a deed, relates to a patent, so many variations. And that's what's kept me so interested in this, is no 2 surveys really are exactly alike. As close as you can come is maybe just a bunch of 4-pin lots in the city, and one after another after another. But when you break out of that city and start to broaden into blocks and so forth, it gets more complicated. Jump out into the rural areas, and you just never know what you're going to find, if you can find anything, when you start getting out along the beaten path where these old surveyors left their tracks. So I'm not going to spend much time other than just a couple of quick things here. In the manual, they talk about original surveys, and I did a little checking around. 332 times they mentioned original surveys. So it's pretty important, and they're mostly housed in our 2009 manual in chapters 5, 6, 7, and 8, and there's 225 references to doing original surveys. And this is one of the things, being county surveyor, and I've been county surveyor actually since about 1999, I guess, in one form or another with different counties. And I see so many times when the surveyors don't get back to the vesting documents and don't get back to the documents that leads them to the original evidence. I dealt with a survey recently in one of the counties that I'm a county surveyor in, and the parties were just missing corners right and left. They didn't bother to get all of the records they needed to find all of the corners. And if you don't even find all the records, how do you know what you're looking for? In this particular case, one of the corners was 90 feet away from another corner they were using. And it really caused havoc when they had to redo their records of survey. So you got to go back as far as you can. Sometimes the information isn't always there. So what we've got here, we're looking southerly, and the orange line, of course, you're all pretty familiar, I think, by now with the overlay of the land net that's on Google Earth. It's available. And so Benson, the north boundary is here on, is everybody seeing the arrow pointing back and forth? Okay.
Yeah.
Good. Benson, of course, surveyed the north boundary of this township, and over on the east boundary. And then Glover surveyed the south boundary and the west boundary. And I think you can get a little bit of a feel of what that terrain's like in there. If you're driving out of Walker, California, you're heading up towards Bridgeport, and you're looking either side there, you got some pretty good mountains and cliffs to go over. It's my personal opinion, after having extensively gone through this township, that the ridge running down here through section 5 and 8 and on down to the bottom to section 32, that ridge, I don't think any one of the surveyors ever ran over that ridge. They came up Mill Creek over here where section 6 is, and actually they came, I know, from the north end and went down through, and they were up here on Bircham Flat also. the nature of the markings on the bearing trees, the markings on the stones, the types of calls and so forth, I almost suspected that there were 3 different GLO crews in here at 3 different times. So when we took on this survey, inside this township, there was one found corner on the USGS quad, and it was a corner with a great big bearing tree by a campground right down here in the bottom of the river. And outside of that, we just had to start searching. There were a few corners located on the exterior boundary. So our chore was only to go after private land within the Toyabe National Forest. So we didn't resurvey the whole thing, but 1874 exterior boundary. And then the guy by the name of C.F. Putnam came along in 1879, 5 years later, and he broke the township down on the inside. Now, Glover and Benson were known cohorts. They were partners down there. And what I'm going to primarily try to do here is just develop the way I went through this township, and then we're just going to study a little bit about section 36, section 6 to make a few points. So let's just move on through here. Anybody doesn't have a copy of this, I can arrange. There's a book called Everybody's Magazine. I got online one time. The late Bud Uzez out of California with State Lands. He and I met on many occasions. He had a copy of this 1905 publication. And so I got busy, and every time I turned around, I tried running them down to see if there's any more available. And one time I hit the jackpot. I found 3 copies of this magazine, and all they cost were $35 a piece. I donated 2 of them to scholarship options, and I think we parlayed about $300 or $400 from each one of them for our scholarships. But since it's out of print, it has no parent company that is behind Everybody's Magazine anymore. It does say on the bottom, you know, copyrighted and that, but I have scanned. I've kept the best magazine for myself, but I have the article in here that is called the West Coast Land Grafters, and it gives a little history of the litigation and the fraudulent surveys of John Benson, probably one of the best ones out there. So anybody want to send me a note or that would like a copy of this insert out of here, I'll gladly, I can make it available. Do you have a copy of this, Trent?
I don't, but I was just going to say I can put it in the Dropbox folder for everybody.
Yeah,
So.
you can just drop it in that box and people can download it. It's several megabytes because there's several pages in color in that. And so I just scanned them.
Okay. Yep. Okay,
so this is just one of the front pages of it here. And this is one of the main prosecutors here. And I'm not going to bore you with any of the reading, but, it just talks a little bit about introduction. There's another article out of the New York Times from way back that I'll also provide for Trent if he doesn't have it. And then a good friend, the late Jim Fields, Forest Service surveyor up in Northern California, was run over by a water truck on his way to work one morning. He actually went back to Washington, D.C., a bunch of research on John Benson, and he has a little article that appeared in the Forest Service publication. I'll make that available to you too. Just gives a good round. So there's John Benson in the younger years on the right, and an old haggard guy like me on the left there. And that's what happens to us surveyors when we spend too much time in the field. But I don't think he really spent too much. Here's a list, they call it the hit list, and this is in Bud Uzez's book, Chaining the Land, out of California. And this gives an idea. There was $1,010,000 worth of work done by these individuals. And some of the people, if those of you that have never read anything about Benson, some of the people on this list are just name only. They were not an actual person. So, but I have had the opportunity of retracing a lot of these surveyors here in the West. The Benson Syndicate hit very hard in California and also to varying degrees in at least 12 other Western states. This is a diagram out of Jim Fields' work that he found from a guy by the name of Dupree Averill, GLO 1937, actually had some of the books he obtained from Glover's widow. And these were some of the diagrams in that book to show you some of the ways that they traverse through the townships. And you'll find that if you do a study on most of these townships, you may find some corners where they show some of these ramblings, but a lot of these other sections, you just never find any corners. That doesn't mean they're not there. You just have to, you're going to have to look. So this is a copy of the original plat for 723. And again, we were looking from the north heading south. So this is the main river going through the middle, Walker River. This is Mill Creek over on this side and Bircham Flat over on the far east side. So again, exteriors, I won't bother to read all this for you. One note that was fun though, we were down in the area working during the week and we parked our vehicles well off the right of way, and it just happened that Caltrans was in there doing some right of way work. They wanted some additional widening of that road. And one of the bosses down there with Caltrans cornered me one day and said, "Where's all your flagmen and your cones and everything?" I said, "Well, we're not working on the highway." He says, "No," he said, "if you're even parking in the right of way, if you're crossing this road surveying, you will you will abide. You're going to put up flagmen and everything." Well, we went ahead and left that area, went and worked elsewhere. We came back on the weekend to work where we needed to, just along the road. But, we weren't tying into any highway monuments or anything. We were after other boundaries. We were leaving that to them. By the time we got through finding a whole bunch of corners up that corridor, and they were already well into their right-of-way acquisition, they weren't too happy with us, because they only tied to that one corner in the bottom, and they went ahead and spread everything out, record bearing and distance. And when you get through here a little bit, you'll see that that doesn't fit too well, record bearings and distances.
Hey, Steve, I hope you told them to pound sand. You're a federale.
Well, I just bowed out at the time and graciously just came back when they weren't around. I didn't even want to confront it. They were pretty adamant. I was surprised they didn't come back and check on us over the weekend or that. Maybe they never suspected it. I don't know. But yeah, I just made a judgment. We didn't have any need to have to, we were well out of the right of way, and we weren't surveying down the road at all. Everything was still with, we weren't using GPS except for control on each end of the project to check into, and then we carried our traverses all the way through. Okay, so one of the places, or one of the ways that I like to look for corners to begin with, is in the office. Now, you don't find many corners in the office, but you can get a good feel of maybe what they did. So I like to take the original plat, and then I like to take a copy of the topographic map, and hopefully, you got a few more corners than this one had, but the exteriors are pretty well nailed down on this one. And then I forget, someplace down in this lower portion is that one corner along the river. So I go ahead and I highlight, like you see with all these black lines, where the major ravines are, and then I take a look at the topographic or the original plat, and I say, well, gee, is there anything that really matches? Get a good feeling, because if they're really fraudulent and they fabricated everything, not much is going to fit. But when they actually surveyed in different places, it may shift around, but you can kind of tell, yeah, they've really been there. So what I like to do, first off, here's a copy of the index sheets out of California. So you can see the surveys that have been done in this particular township. You got C.F. Putnam up here in 1879, and you got Glover and Benson, 1874, and they're all color coded on this diagram. And then you got Wilson and Johnson, and you got myself and Jepson in here in 1986, 88. And there's a later one here because there was some more. Well, no, it's the township to the north I'll hit after. The reason that I bring this up is over here on the far right-hand corner, you got book and page. So you have to go to a index sheet in California first to find out what volume the notes are in, and then what page in that volume to get the pages. That's how their system is set up in California. So it's a several step process. But right now, the notes are not online in California yet. I'm privileged to have a drive with them all on because of our work that we've done there, and through our CFEDS activities and so forth. So I at least can access all the notes right now for California, but they're not through yet. They're still printing them. So I like to take a copy of black and white of the plat, and I put red lines down all of those ravines. And then I like to take a topographic map and I put green lines down those ravines. And then I just make a Mylar overlay of one of them and lay it on the other and say, how well do these match? There's some differences, of course. But in general, when I looked at this, I said, yeah, it looks like the guy was there. So that gives me a good, at least warm, fuzzy feeling that maybe we're going to find something. So this is a copy of our final plat in the area. And you don't see everything on here. Right here, as we were trying to find this northwest corner of section 36, at the time, and then there's a break line here. You see that doesn't really match here. You got a break line. 36 is way over here, further a couple miles to the east. And we were having a real tough time locating either the north or the west boundary of 36. We had the east boundary and the south boundary nailed down, all three corners on each line, all five corners all together. Glover on the south and Benson on the east. But we were having a tough time breaking in, and there's private land in that particular section. So I went ahead and let my crew work elsewhere, and I got out my aerial photography that, by the way, I had to borrow from the Forest Service because the BLM didn't have any aerial photography on this area. And I learned the old way back in the 1960s of how to plot corners on aerial photography with a topographic map and the geolo notes. And so I plotted some really neat calls to the north of this northwest corner, a couple of miles. I drove up there, and within a half hour, I popped off and found a section corner 2 miles from this northwest corner. I had a handheld GPS, and I navigated south, picked up a quarter corner, navigated south, picked up another section corner. Now I'm a mile away. I never did find the first quarter corner north of this northwest corner, but it gave me an arrow, you might say, and it pointed me down to a good search area. And the reason it was so important, I'll show you here in a little bit. You can see the three corners I went up and found here. Couldn't find the one between section 25 and 26. But you have Cottonwood Creek running in a northwesterly direction here. When Putnam surveyed in here, he surveyed into the area and he was just southwest of that creek. So when he went east and he went north, just a half a chain or less, he entered the creek. He had an aspen post in a mound of earth with 4 aspen bearing trees in 1879. Now, I hadn't seen an aspen bearing tree from that far back in a long, long time. And particularly, there's all kinds of beaver on this creek. And of course, you know how beavers love a steady diet of aspen. So by the time I use these 3 corners to do a point to just find out where up and down that creek we might look more stringently, because I had an idea that maybe that corner was somewhat disjointed from the exterior boundary. Duh, does that ever happen? So at any rate, got us to a neat search area. And I wish I'd taken more pictures, but I have probably about a 2-foot diameter hollow core of a aspen sitting right next to the creek on the southwest side of the creek. I sat there for about an hour and a half, reaching way down inside that core and pulling out bits and pieces. And all of a sudden I pulled out some reverse scribing on that aspen tree. And off that, then, assuming that one of the bearing trees, we moved up and I found one more bearing tree face down, and they had scribed that one on the bark. And the bark was laying face down on the grass underneath it. So we had 2 bearing trees. Never found any remnant of the wooden post, but we had 2 absolute bearing trees. Well, let's see what the result was there by the time we get through. By the way, the big black X's on here were the only corners that we did not find. All the rest of them in here, we found all those other corners. So we had a pretty good 86% recovery for a Benson Syndicate survey. So, be careful. Okay, so here again, overall, we retraced 41.5 miles of original section lines here. We have deviations from record up to 8 chain distances. And in this kind of country, that's a lot of search area on the slope, on those rocky slopes in there. Up to 9 degrees off cardinal between found corners. So already your mind may be going, okay, how long are you going to search? If you have one corner you found and you go out there record bearing the distance, and then you've got to increase your search area in that kind of country by up to 8 chains and 9 degrees. How many people could give a reasonable estimate on a job and come out smelling good? Only the government, huh? Deep pockets, right? So anyway, we had to proportion 10 corners by the time we were through here. This gives you an idea of the nearly cardinal lines, just to show the deviations. I kind of held the outside to a scale and ran the cardinal line. Of course, this section 36 sits over here, another section to the east. And then the retraced lines in blue. So you can kind of see how it fits. Not really that bad in my books. If all the geolo surveys that I ran across were as good as this one, we'd really be in Fat City. Some are much worse. Here in Nevada, quarter mile, half mile. Those of us that's had a pretty steady diet of Nevada, it's not only do you have that much deviation between found corners in places, but sometimes you have 2 and sometimes 3 corners by the GLO representing the same corner. And land patented out to each one of them as it's come along from, say, 1865, and then another survey in 1875, another one in 1901. So what about down the river there, Mr. Lynn Smith? We got a few extra corners down the Truckee River, don't we?
Yes, we do.
Yes, we do. So the dashed lines there in green are lines probably not closed to the exterior boundary. And you can kind of see why when you take a look at the deviation in here. It was very common when the exterior boundaries got surveyed that the interior, I think they started from one of the corners, and it's hard to figure out which ones, but why should they run that half mile? Gee, the corner's already over there. They don't get paid for the random. And so they just, stubbing out was just such a common practice. And there's all kinds of variations of that stubbing out. Sometimes the terrain dictates it. Yeah, that mountain range I mentioned early on running down through the middle here, this is the area that I really believe that they never really ran the line. They probably ran a half mile one direction or the other, but I don't think they crossed over that mountain.
Having looked at that range of mountains there, I can understand why they didn't, because that's pretty
right.
up and down straight.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Well, we were in them and we've been over them a couple of times. That was in my younger years. So let's take a closer look at sections 36 and 6. Here again, we got Mill Creek, we got West Walker River, and we got Bircham Flat. I'll bring this up later. There's something I wanted to show you too. So let's take a look at section 36 first. Okay. So here's the original plat. Here, Benson, we have a stone and a mound of stone in a rock slide. Now, yours truly here has visited a lot of Benson corners over my career. I have yet to find a Benson rock with chisel marks on it. It's obvious in most of the cases, he put a larger rock in a mound of stone, like we call kind of a capstone, and his bearing trees. But his bearing trees aren't always record bearing in distance out of his notes either. You just kind of have to look around. And of course, when it doesn't match record bearing in distance and you don't have an actual corner, you have to do a little bit of guessing and guesswork as to how you're going to put a missing corner back in off some bearing trees that don't match record. So all kinds of things. So anyway, right down here in the bottom of the creek on Cottonwood Creek, we actually found a bearing tree with an aspen that had about 2 or 3 branches on it with some green leaves sticking out of it, and that was about it. I popped open the face of it. It had your typical blaze, and there the interior was completely rotted, and the exterior of it, it had grown over. Fortunately, that tree had the bark removed, and the cambium layer had been flattened, and they scribed it in the meat wood. A lot of the bearing trees of aspen nature, when they were real small, all they did was scribe it on the bark. So, you know, anything goes. So anyway, the only disappointing thing when I got down here searching for this corner, Forest Service had already been there. There was a nice red post with a sign right next to a mound of stone alongside the creek. But they hadn't put a sign on the bearing tree, so I'm not sure they found it when they posted that suspicious mound of stone. And swung over, and there we go, 1/4 SBT on it. One of the few times when I was occupying the northeast corner of Benson's Corner, had a person down here on Glover's Township corner, we could see straight through the whole mile. And it's not very often in this country you can see a mile at a time. Okay. So here's the final results of section 36. As I mentioned, we got all 5 corners on the east and the west boundary. Take a look at the variations between Benson's northeast and east quarter, 0.85 chain, about, what would you say, maybe about 45 feet or 50 feet or so. But he has a 3-chain bust between Benson and Glover. You think Benson closed in on that? Probably not. Down here on Glover, a 2-chain bust on the last half mile, but all 3 of these corners were set by Glover. Glover, however, could have set this coming up from the exteriors of the township in another area, and who knows how he got to the west boundary. And this could be a situation of not even closing back on your own line. But giving the benefit of the doubt, here we are at southwest 8913. Here we are southwest 8855, pretty close bearing. So maybe he just goofed and dropped 2 chains someplace through here. Who knows? So when you've got these corners, the natural thing to do is go record bearing and distance a half mile north, maybe record bearing and distance a half mile to the west, or whatever record would be. But because of being able to find those 3 pointer corners, I call, to the north, it isolated the area. We found 2 bearing trees, and this is the result. We end up here about 6 chains short on that north boundary. We have a bearing that is off here, not all that much. It's a couple of degrees. But look at this one, almost 3 degrees off going to the northwest corner, but only 28 links short in that whole mile. Who, you know, where were they? What were they doing? But this is a good lesson here to be careful. If you couldn't find this corner, where do you go from there? How far do you go? Well, you go until you get the control you need. Because the bottom line is, unfortunately, and when you're dealing with federal land for sure, you would be forced to do a double proportion on this corner. So you would have to go find the next nearest corners. One thing can be guaranteed. The quarter corner we ended up putting in, the north quarter and the west quarter, I guarantee that's not where the original corner is at if it was ever set. We searched and we searched. Now you've got at least 2 search areas. You got 3 really, but you got 2 search areas for the north quarter. A half mile west of the northeast, a half mile east of the northwest, and the midpoint, which is probably the most unlikely. So this is just, you know, what you end up with, that you can really get yourself in trouble if a client, say, owns just a portion of this section 36, and you're burdened with, you give them a $5,000 estimate to go out and do this job, not realizing that you may have to survey 8, 10, 12 miles and proportion, and then maybe never find the original corner because you have not got the right corners to lead you to where it's at. So the only thing in my book that I've come to the conclusion, when I don't find a corner, That's all there is to it. I didn't find the corner. I will never say it's not there unless I could find it uprooted, the bearing trees down the hill, don't know where they came from. Or I really feel good that something has come through the area and torn that corner out. But you'll never know when you find them this far apart. So here's a view. This is one of the simpler sections. This is the northeast up here. Here's the one with the little aspen bearing tree down in the bottom. We can see all the way from this northeast one down to the township corner. This is the creek, and fortunately, there were no beaver dams any place up this creek that we could see. The beaver started another quarter mile or so down. Had the beaver moved further up this creek, I'm not sure we would have found any of those bearing trees, having been gone years before. So we really lucked out finding the remnants of those two right there. We did have to do our share of walking on this township here because there were no roads back in here. We weren't using ATVs or that. So we did a lot of walking in this township for sure. Okay, anybody got any questions or comments about section 36? Okay, we'll move forward. Let's jump up to little old section 6. Isn't that one of the most troublesome sections we ever have anyway? And of course, I always enjoyed working with lottings. But you can see what we have here is we got Benson on the north boundary, only over to the quarter corner, the north quarter of section 6. Glover surveyed the entire west boundary. And we found all three of Glover's corners. The north quarter had been proportioned in by a 1940s vintage survey to the north. We'll end up with that just briefly when we get through here. They did find, however, the Benson corner for the northeast. And we found the east quarter, the southeast, and the south quarter. So how did we find them and what did they look like? Here is section 6 when we got through. So anybody tell me where the private land is in this section?
Section 6 or 5.
Nobody wants to venture a guess? Okay, I give up.
Is it the unlotted area there, Steve?
Go ahead.
Is it the unlotted area?
You got it. It's the unlotted areas. The government cannot return areas in a private lotted or a private portion of a section, lot, adequate part, or whatever. It is still the record area. Now, by computation, you could probably figure it out. But take a look here. Lot 14, 31.5 acres for a nominal 40 acre. So you can just see by examination that these are not their full share, are they? So what I want you to look at here in the next slide here in a minute is the variations here. If you say that the landowners here did have this section corner down here in the bottom, but they were unable to find anything else. And they hire you, Joe Smith surveyor, to come out and you are asked to locate their 340 acres, you know. They're supposed to have 120 government acres out there. So you diddy bop out here and you start doing your measuring, looking for these corners. So let's take a look at what the results here is on this section. Here is a diagram with the lines pretty much shown on the topographic map. Now, mind you, we got Benson on the north, we got Glover on the west, and we got Putnam 5 years later on the interior. To me, this is just absolute proof positive that they did not connect to the exterior boundary. So take a look at the dimensions out here. You could take a look at the original plat. This last dimension out here is supposed to be 38.9 chains, right? For that last half mile closing into the west boundary. Well, it's only 31.29 chains from the found corner. So if you were to run out from the section corner, the southeast, and run west, record 40 chains, you would be 365 feet away from the original corner. If you were to run from that same section corner and run due north, you would be 264 feet away from where we found the quarter corner. Now, this is what really burns private landowners when they don't understand this. And many surveyors, of course, are they going to take the extra effort, in this case, to look in at least a +3 chain circle from the record varying distance from a found corner. And down here, you're going to have yourself a 5.5 to 6 chain circle. Your south 5.5 chains and away from that corner. And, you know, it just leaves it up to how long you're going to search. And there were no bearing trees to either one of these two corners, okay? Just a mound of stone with a stone in it. So you can see the problem here. This entire section itself ends up, let me go to the next slide. On that section, the record was 625 acres record. You see the original plat over here. There's only 547 acres in that section. Someplace there's a missing 78 acres. I've dealt with a lot of lawsuits that's what the government was being sued for, was cheating them out of their patent. And they just didn't understand monument control. So I use this example many, many times just to try and catch the attention of individuals as to, you know, how long do you search? And you can see the dashed lines on here of the USGS. And they go through kind of a bit of an exercise too of trying to proportion things in. You can see they've got a real askance line on this particular one, but how easy it would be for a landowner to maybe just grab this topographic indication of a corner. Of course, it's not a found corner, and just say, oh, I can kind of tell where that's out on the ground. I'm going to fence this off because I'm going to start running my cattle down in here, you know, and I don't want them to get over on the forest. So any comments up to this point?
I would just say one question, like you're saying you didn't find any bearing trees or anything like that. So, but you're finding a stone and a rock mound. What, just your comfort level and why you felt like that was your point 400 feet away?
Marked rock. They were mound of stone. This is Putnam, and he marked his rocks good on the inside.
Okay.
Yep.
Which was different than Benson with no marked stones. So
exactly.
Yep. Okay.
Now, another thing too, take a look here. Now we're what? We're probably 2.5 chains short on Putnam's going to the north. And we're, look at this, 40.19. Right. So the distance is there. This one, of course, 2.5 chains. Okay, you know, spread out. Just start looking.
Yeah.
All my career since the first corner I found in June of 1963 in Holiday Park on the Weber River in Utah, I go way back. I was taught by an individual last summer with the Forest Service to just lay your backpack down. You've got a search area and just start circling the wagons, go in an ever increasing circle. And it's been all my career that you don't just look in a obvious location by bearing and distance. So, okay.
Hey, Steve, Rob McMillan here.
Yes, Rob.
Hey, you said that in this case, you'd need to have a 3-chain radius probably to find some of these points, some of these stone mounds and such.
Mm-hmm.
But not only do you have to have that 3-chain radius, but you have to have the eye to recognize what it is that might be a clue. Like you said on the other section, the fallen aspen tree and finding the bark underneath that tree scribed.
Yep.
I mean, man, that's high level stuff. When
yep.
you're,
I've got pictures of that one, fortunately.
Man.
Yeah, you figure that aspen had been scribed on that bark in 1879. And we were
amazing.
1980, 86, 87.
110 years later.
Yeah. Unbelievable, huh? But yep.
George here.
The thing is, in
That's-
this part of the country, these aspen are under snow for a long time in the winter. So, you know, they they didn't get real big. And they had a long non-growth period of time. So.
That's kind of like that survey you and I did up in Warm Springs, where we
Yep.
found some pretty old corners with 4x4 oak posts that were more like 2x2 oak posts because they'd shrunk so much from drying out.
Yep. Yeah, considered if this place wasn't full of rocks and stuff and all you had was wooden posts all the time. That's when it gets a little touchier.
Now we know why most of us drink.
Yeah, yes. So here's just an aerial view again of this section. Beautiful canyon up here. By the way, I got the Marines in trouble up here. As we worked our way south, we got up there and that Marine encampment down there by Colville and that, they use this area for a winter training ground. And there's, they didn't know anything about, pack it in and pack it out. Their communication wire, we just brought out rolls and rolls of communication wire. We found the places where they were taking their cheesy cans and their gum wrappers and everything, and they would dug a little pit and they were making a little garbage pit out there. I kind of got the Forest Service involved in going in and looking at it, and they got the little Marine boys out there and they went and cleaned up their mess. And they had a contract to utilize that area with the Forest Service and keep it clean. So it's kind of fun. I mean, no disrespect for the Marines, but the little boys could have carried things out of there pretty easy. Okay, so let's just take a look here as we close out this piece of it on Walker River here. Those three sections there, we literally found all the corners around those three sections. Look at that terrain. The contours tell you what it's all about, right? And here, of course, is the original plat. And here's the corners we found. So you take a look here. Here's 34 chains between two. There's 37.5. Here's 36.65, 38, 39.96. Pretty good measure there. And even as you go up into that rough country down here on the bottom of section 21, 38.57, 39.38. Not too bad. Here's a 5-degree deviation here. It may have been a line along that hellacious hillside they didn't run. Thing is, you'll never know what kind of shortcuts. Maybe they ran it and because of the terrain, they got off. Maybe they hit an area with ore in that deviated the needle on their compass. Who knows what? So many variations. But you can see with all of the unlotted areas, those are all private land in there that's unlotted. But see, all of section 36 was unlotted and it was all private land with a Forest Service boundary. So there's shows you where the private lands are in there.
Steve?
Okay, yes.
So since most of that measurement is short and you're dealing with steep terrain, is there any history on how they try to correct their slope distances on their chaining? I mean, was it
No,
a wild guess and steeper terrain would show that they're shorter in measure when you have a pretty good array of found original corners there, so really can't do an indexing, but is there any sort of continuity that you could draw from?
I've looked at that too, Mike. Just take, for instance, the line here between sections 1621 and 1522. So we have really rough country going more, rougher than it is to the east. And you got what, nearly 2 chains here. You got what, 3.5 or 3+ chains here on the westerly side. But look how good it is over here. The terrain over here was just about as rough. Sometimes I think it might have been their way of just traversing through the country just to get through there. And they forced themselves to go on some of these lines. I don't know. One thing we found here too is we have a few line trees down here we found. And those line trees matched good for one side of the river and they didn't for the other. And we, working with the BLM on this one, we ignored a couple of those line trees because they were so far offline. We just determined they did not run the remaining portion, such as this line down here at 38, 36. The river, of course, runs just the other side of the road down here. And there was a lime tree just on the west side of the river. We didn't find anything else on the east side. It looked to us like they set this north-south quarter of 22 coming westerly off the southeast, because the last quarter plus mile, more than a quarter mile here, was just up rocks and crags all the way through. So we did not use the line tree down here to create an angle point on that line. And you know, usually a line tree, when found, it becomes a point on the line, right?
Yeah, you're really lucky you found so many original corners. Can you imagine proportioning in from those wild card line trees? Look like.
Yep. But in this case too, though, this is where a landowner ended up getting a little extra land. Well, maybe not. 3890 is a chain off here and 2 chains long here, probably a little more than 160 there. But then some of these others down here, they just didn't get their fair share. See, like up here in the northeast of 16, you got lot 1 being 3272. So you know those other 3 lots are pretty small in there. So they're missing quite a few acres up there. Okay, let's just jump to wrap this up to the township immediately north. And where that is down here on the bottom. We're looking again at the same township we're in. We're just going to turn around now and go north. And in doing so, this is the township plat. And so this goes up through Antelope Valley. The Walker is right here, and they just had the disastrous fire, the big one that I guess maybe it's out by now with the cold weather, George.
I hope so.
Alville. But they just recently too burned, I forget how many homes right in Walker and right up Antelope Valley. Started right down there. Something started down by a barbecue place down there on the highway. The winds, those 65, 70 mile an hour winds. I seen a diagram that Greg Phillips, I think he's on here with us today, he sent a diagram showing which homes have been burnt in this little valley right down in here. And that wind just wiped them out. And you know, you wouldn't think you're not sitting there in the forest or anything, but what a year we've had, huh? So here again on this township now, we have all Benson and Glover. Benson on the south and the east and the entire interior, Glover on the west and the north, all in 1874. Now, I like this township. What I did is I went ahead and I took a look at the plat and the notes that was done in the 1940s. So you can see it's pretty regular. And again, they got some pretty rough country over here on the east side and somewhat on the southwest. So all of the blue diamonds are the original corners found in the 40s by the GLO in that dependent resurvey. So be careful how much you badmouth Benson himself when he was out there or his crew. All of the other corners, the circles, were proportioned. Now it's interesting, see the green squares running down through Antelope Valley. If you were to read the original notes and then read the notes here by the 1940s dependent resurvey, they did something rather unusual back then, but to me it showed some compassion. Before the 1940s survey, there were some engineers in there that had been doing some survey work, and they had established some corners down through this area that everybody had settled to. When the GLO came in the 1940s, and of course this is before 1946, so they were not the BLM, they were the General Land Office still. They came in and they found the pins from the engineers in here that everybody settled to. They also found in several locations where these little green squares are, evidence of Benson's corners. And in their notes, they noted Benson's corners and they accepted the local corners so they would not upset the apple cart in the area. I thought, how interesting back there in the mid-1940s that they were doing that. And so, you know, you get somebody who says, oh, you know, you've always got to take the original monument. Well, I'll leave you with one last story. A colleague of mine, it was a chief of cadastral up in Oregon for a number of years. He kind of took a little heat from a lot of the chiefs in the BLM when there was a quarter corner, I think, around the Portland area that had been proportioned in, but it was also controlled for government land. And lo and behold, years on, somebody found the original corner. Well, Mike Gardner, and I think he made the right decision too. He went ahead and left it alone. He did not upset the apple cart in an urban area around Portland there by moving everything to that original corner, because the whole world had been tied to the proportioned corner that was in there. So there can be exceptions. So at any rate, in this particular township here, we've got 91 out of 133 corners in existence. They accepted 11 local corners as the best available evidence, even though they found some evidence of Benson, and they ended up with only 31 lost corners in this whole township. So I thought that was quite a picture of, and they're all, you know, not too big a deviation if you were to, you know, zoom in and take a look at the bearings and distances. Again, now this township, the index card again from the BLM down there in California. So the Parrish and Jepson here, the only line is just a little green line down here, and that's the northerly end of the township we just visited. And then since then, Mickelson, Brian worked for me. He came out of California or Colorado, and he's now the field section chief down in California. His initials are BLM, and he said he was always prone to work for the BLM. But he came in, and you can see all the sections that he subdivided now down in and around Antelope Valley and that. So happy corner searching. Any additional questions? And I appreciate your attendance.
I've got one. Did you find the damn cannon yet?
No, let me back here, George. That's what I wanted to hit. Right here where he got Bertram Flat, Fremont, John C. Fremont came through this country in January of about 1849, I believe. I may be off a few years. And he was coming up out of the Bridgeport country, coming up, and he hit Bertram Flat. He's coming down across Bertram Flat. He drops down into Lost Canyon here. Well, his troops up here, it's all recorded, they were pulling this Fremont cannon with them. They got down here, and John C. Fremont and Kit Carson went ahead and told them to hang tight, troops. We're going to come up this godforsaken canyon. They came on up above here. They took a look, and they could see Antelope Valley and said, oh, we have a way out. So they came back to get their troops, and their troops basically said, boss, we are not going to drag this such and such cannon up that such and such hill. So they hid the cannon down there with the anticipation of coming back. Well, down in this deep canyon down here, I'm a member of a group called the Cannoneers. And I wasn't with them at the time. They did find two of the rims of the trailer that they were pulling that cannon on. Forget the name of it. And they also found part of the trunnion plate in the creek down underneath. We've been in and out of this canyon time and time again trying to find the bell, the 230-pound brass bell. We've never found it yet. And we're not really positive. There were like, I think 11 or 12, maybe 13 cannons of the French Algerian style that was built here in America. And Fremont absconded onto one and drug it all the way west and then left it down here in this canyon. And whether or not somebody else has it, we don't know. But there is a canyon.
UNR.
Pardon?
It's up at UNR right now. They got it back.
Yeah, and they keep changing colors every other year.
Yeah.
Many. Anyway, yeah, good old Lost Canyon there. So I got to know this area quite well. Thanks, George, for bringing that up. That's fun.
Thank you, Steve, for sharing all your experiences with us. It's greatly appreciated and it's valuable information.
Thank you. Any questions, any comments? Michael, I just love you up there. I need to come to Alaska again.
Yeah, that's my cabin. It's snowing again. We had about 6 inches today. So yeah, I'm 100 miles off the grid, no power, no generator running here. Got high-speed internet. It's pretty cool. Anyway, hey, a couple comments on that. On the bark scribing, that's very interesting. In the last 18 months, I've been helping one of the 638 Indian contractors write their records up. They were woefully behind, and did a lot of recoveries of GLO surveys in the 1910 to 1919. There were fortunately metal monuments in Alaska, but on the bearing trees where they bark scribe the soft tissue type trees like the aspen and birch, we're seeing the same thing. And it was pretty revealing that that's probably a better way to scribe those trees rather than going to the cambium layer, because the same type of tree would heal over like your hardwoods, your spruce, your hemlock, and then all you're seeing is maybe what you think is a blaze, and without really cutting the tree apart, being able to see those scribe marks. So bark scribing, I think, was sort of, a secondary type of scribing originally, but now with the course of time and doing the retracement and dependent resurvey work, finding that it's a lot easier to see those bearing tree evidence and being able to confirm that's an original tree. And so it's a best practice, I think, within the Bureau and their contractors here in Alaska, that they're trying to bark scribe those type of trees in present day original surveys.
For those that may not know, Mr. Schroeder here is a retired cadastral chief out of Alaska. And where else did you have your career at, Mike?
All my surveying, other than the time that I was in the photogrammetric end, where I was all over the world with airplanes doing direct georeferencing type imagery. I was licensed in 1982 as a state licensed surveyor. So I have a mix of about 25 some years in private sector and about the same 20 years in the Bureau. Well, actually 15 years in the Bureau. Last 10 years the chief in Alaska.
Okay, I've always got one more story, and because you're on bearing trees there, in this same township, we talked about bark scribing on things like birch and aspen and so forth. We were kind of discouraged at first there. We would find corners of Putnams on the interior. We'd swing around to where it's supposed to be a bearing tree, and we couldn't find any blazes or anything on the tree that was obviously supposed to be the bearing tree. Well, we got down into where into that lower end of Mill Creek there, and all of a sudden we had a big fir bearing tree with typical blaze marks on it. So we swing around to a big old ponderosa type, actually Jeffrey pine, and it was about a 2.5, 3 foot diameter, and we still didn't see any blaze. And we got looking, and there was a flat spot on the bark on that pine tree, and they had flattened it off with an axe, and they had put the scribing in the bark on a pine tree. And what we determined then, after going back and finding other bearing trees, was if the pine tree was about 2 foot or less, they would remove the bark and scribe on the cambium layer. If it was 2 foot or greater, they didn't want to cut into that big, thick bark, apparently. They just scribed. We found several trees in that township, bark scribed, pine trees, good-sized ones. So that was another eye-opener, too, in that particular area.
Yeah, interesting.
The obvious, just look for evidence.
The cottonwood trees, that when they grow, they'll look like an aspen when they're young and smaller diameter, but then they get that really elongated, deep, type of bark that, bark scribing kind of goes away with that. You can't see.
Yep.
The other comment I'd have, and this is maybe some good insight for the audience here, because I was involved in the rewrite of the manual in 2009 quite a bit. And before I was cadastral chief, and there was a lot of discussion about, changes to the manual about accepting non-federal corners as good faith, reestablishment of original corner positions. And I think that Bob Dahl, kind of guided everybody through it. And I can remember Mr. Harmoning too, doing this, that if the private land surveyor did just as you did, Steve, and said, I did a diligent search, I'm in a really a tough township, but at the end of the day, I couldn't find that original corner. And I'm saying that I couldn't find it. So I used proper methods. The manual said a single or double proportionate. And then it sets it in the landowners rely on that, the private landowners, and maybe you got the federal boundary on the other side. We really shouldn't be throwing this thing out. I mean, the ones there, somebody comes in and they don't do a diligent look, or they crank a 90 and go a half a mile, stuff like that. You gotta, it's a tougher call because you still have the same element of the private landowners have been relying on that corner out there. But I think the 2009 manual is a big switch in the right direction of have the Bureau really look at these corners closely before you disregard them and you don't accept them in the federal record, which that action, when those final field notes and the dependent resurvey accepts one of those local corners, then they have that status of in perpetuity of, original federal corner. So I see a lot of good out of it. I know there's lots of history in different states, but I think we're headed in the right direction with that. So it's interesting to hear your comments in the presentation. It's pretty good.
Appreciate that, Mike.
Hey, Steve.
Yes.
I noticed that last Benson Township that you showed was pretty regular. And so you could come up with some good search areas. Do you ever use GMM to plug that stuff in and come up with your search areas?
Yeah, we used it. Like I say, I've been a long time since I've been involved in, utilizing that. Right now, I just come onto the GCDB database too. But I never got into GMM personally. My staff did that I worked with, but I didn't get into GMM. But it's I'm sure it's just as good an analysis and to give you a good start. Again, what's your what do they call that in the GCDB? Your reliability factor. How far away? 750-foot circle or a 10-foot circle.
Yeah, we found that when we've done hundreds of townships using GMM, we found that if the original surveys were done well, that stuff will nail it down within 12 feet.
Right. Yeah, it depends on the quality of the original survey for sure.
Yeah, it's a great tool.
And again, from the other side of the fence, I would agree with you that as they're going through evaluating all these mix of measurements, when there's a series of measurements within a township, especially, the GCDB group does the best to come up with what they believe is the best fit for that corner. And then statistics are there, so it gives those users that reliability error ellipse to look at it. In the private sector, I've done the same thing with just take a private subdivision that has some pretty wild measurement and maybe a lot of non-original corners and a lot of errors on the plat. And it can be just, you have one surveyor coming in there and finding two corners and going record and another one come from there. And it's just so hard to figure out. And what I found is a really great tool is the least squares adjustment. Put in all the bearings and distances from the plat, put your found positions on corners, both those that are original and those that are resurveys, and you weight them for different things. And when that adjustment runs, I mean, maybe you'll find busts of, even degrees or bearing quadrants flopped or dropped 10 feet on a single distance. And it just takes all the chaos out, because when you run that, you say you use StarNet or something like that, and it adjusts it to fit the best. And so the outliers are really big errors. They're 10
Yep.
degree bearing or quadrant or something like that. So that really helps you, I guess, then dial in your search for coordinates for the original corners, because you can isolate what those plat blunders were, and you can de-weight the surveys that didn't follow proper procedure and that type of thing. So that's not a lot of people use that tool that way. Sort of like Steve said, he looks at things in the office before he goes to field. You can do that. You can look at records of survey and other surveys of record within the private subdivision, and maybe try to sort some of that out before you put boots on the ground out there. Just a hint, it works.
That's awesome. Back to Michael. He's also wants to present the history of Alaskan BLM surveying as well. So we're going to find room for Michael here over the next 6 weeks or so. So.
Yeah, and actually seeing this format too, that presentation's like a 4-hour deal. So I'll pick up a piece out of that. Some of the things that's pretty different in Alaska was right in the 1960s, our airborne control surveys and photogrammetric cadastral surveys of townships, and the auto surveyor, which was what we see now in inertial guidance systems in our little drones, are based on the same technology that the BLM was putting inertial guidance systems out of nuclear submarines and helicopters and putting in corners in at 2-mile intervals in a meter air ellipse. So I can show you a whole bunch of pictures and talk about those type of surveys. Probably for people that haven't worked in Alaska, they've never seen that type of thing, but it's pretty fascinating. So we'll do that, Trent. We'll pare it down so it's like an hour, so we can have some questions.
Absolutely. Rob had something for you.
Yeah, this is Rob McMillan. I'm CLSA's president-elect this year. And yeah, maybe just give these folks a taste of that. And maybe we'll get you on the agenda to help out with the CLSA, NOWS, and I believe we're up to 5 other states, including Alaska Conference that's coming up. We're going to do a big online conference. Maybe you just give them a little taste, give them a little freebie, and then we'll set the hook.
Yeah, I was invited to do that because I offered and volunteered through our Alaska Society of Professional Land Surveyors, and that's in March, right? The West Fed is taking the lead.
Mm-hmm.
Still working on the dates, but yep.
Yeah. I think it's 27th through 30th.
Okay.
That was the last thing I saw, and yeah, just give them enough to make them jump into that state conference for us.
Yeah, I was thinking that maybe I'd deal with some of our unique water boundary issues up here, but I haven't quite decided. So anyway, we'll see. I'll be there. I'll be a presenter in that, so it'll be fun.
That'll be perfect.
Well, thank you, Steve, and thank you, Michael, for this great presentation today, and for Trent and Heather for putting this together. This has been fantastic.
Yeah, this format is really nice. I do miss the samples on the table from the old days.
Right.
Steve. And then one other comment is when you're looking for corners, look over your shoulder as you're walking away.
Right.
Sometimes you pick up something that you haven't seen before.
Exactly. And I think, in short, the sum this one up is you might as well look about a 300-foot radius. Go ahead.
Steve did a good job. I used to say, look between my feet. I can't remember how many that, in Alaska, we had pretty regular, really good surveys, but sometimes there were problems, and searching around, increasing that radius, and finally say, oh man, I just got to take a leak. And then you're sitting there taking a leak out in the woods, and you look to your left and go, I'll be dang, there it is. Right there. Sometimes that inner sense that you kind of stopped in the same place that original guy did, I guess. And a chain out or 2 chains out or something like that.
Yeah, exactly.
For us, is a big thing in Alaska.
There's
That
one.
1879 aspen bearing tree of John Benson's. This is the reverse scribing piece out of that. I was given the pleasure of being part of the Great Basin College honor there, and the post that I built was John Benson's aspen post and have all kinds of neat surveyors' signatures on it and that. So if you could see this in person, this is the reverse scribing that grew back into where the scribing was on the meatwood of it. And it's 1/4 S here. I left the BT out there on it. I doubt that tree is standing now, but I'm the proud owner of, there you can see it right there. That's the post.
That's awesome.
To go in the grave with me. Not
Taking
too
off with
soon.
original evidence, huh, Steve?
Yep, absconded on some original evidence. Don't tell anybody, Mike, okay?
Do you have another kind of feel for other fraudulent, quote unquote, fraudulent surveyors that were in the West?
I didn't catch all of that again.
Like a list of kind of other fraudulent surveyors that you came across?
Oh, yeah. I can name quite a number of them. Well, sometimes they're just kind of partially fraudulent, but the Hanson brothers, for one, and some actually Smiles, Prater, all of them were, I would say, partially fraudulent. The place I haven't worked is over in Humboldt County, California. And I don't know, is I saw here where, Frank, are you still online, Neiman?
Yes.
Yeah, Humboldt County, they've got township after township over there that they've never found an original corner yet. And you've probably worked in some of those areas, Frank, right?
He's muted, so
If you're muted there.
he may have stepped away.
Anyway, they don't even have some of the exterior boundaries on some of those, and it is just to varying degrees. It's just you either find it or you don't.
Gotcha.
Well, the guy that followed up and did the subdivision, Mr. Reed, down there at Mill Creek Town Site, in the survey that Steve did, there were brass caps up on the side of the hill set in was that early 50s or late 40s? And then Walt Reed didn't walk to the top of the hill to tie those in, so that township that town site that was filed in the mid 50s has a 60 to 100 foot gap and overlap.
Yep.
Into federal land. After they did all this work.
Yeah. Yeah, a lot of times we're not the
But you're
popular
right.
people in town.
But you're right, Steve. We had lots of townships that there were not a single original corner recovered, and you'd work in some townships. I think on township 4 North 4 East out of Humboldt Meridian, we did that entire township, and we subdivided it under the government contracts. And
Yep.
I think in that one we recovered 6 original corners, and that was it. And they were in the periphery of the township. Pretty amazing. Yeah, you're and more of an authority than I am about this, Steve. But I think people have commented that in Trinity County alone, it's like 90% of that county was fraudulent. It's almost like if you get a call to do a survey in Trinity County, it's better to punt than to take on the liability.
Yeah, I've always recognized that the private sector can't really make a living in those kinds of townships. And if they get into it, they have no idea what they're getting into when they hit those kinds. And landowners can't really afford it. And surveyors, there's no way they can charge what it would take to do it legally.
precisely. One of the things that has occurred up here is there are a lot of cutting contracts between the government and SPI, some of the bigger timber companies up here. They've agreed to it, and you know, they'll agree to settle on the GDBC points just so that they can get in there and cut timber. And you know, that's fairly common. It's too bad it had to get to that, but you know, that's what Benson did to us up here.
Yeah, he left his mark, didn't he?
Actually, no, we didn't.
He left it in more ways than one, though.
Well,
That
it looked
and
like
the
he went to the field though. I mean, he shortcutted the procedures of, I mean, that's a big lesson. So the manual showed the steps to do your own quality control, to tell how you're doing. When they went in the middle of those townships and just stair stepped and did it, they lost all that quality control. And so, but it's so different than a barroom survey, like maybe you had in Humboldt, where they never went out there, set a corner. They just drafted up some notes and a plat, and it was just a fraud. I don't know what's worse. They're both bad, but they're different.
maybe we can do one, Trent and some of the others from Nevada on the Settlemyre notes here in Nevada sometime, huh?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah, that's another story.